The story begins with Henry Hill from Goodfellas, a man who spent years serving the Mafia, only to betray those closest to him in the end, a narrative fitting perfectly into Scorsese's world of crime and treachery. In an early scene, Henry introduces his associates, and among them appears a heavy man with a mustache known as Fat Andy, a character inspired by a real figure from the Gambino crime family. What surprises the audience is that the role wasn't played by a professional actor, but by a New York police officer named Louis Eppolito, creating an ironic moment where a cop portrays a mobster. Ippolito came from a long line of criminals. His grandfather, father, and uncle all worked for the Gambino family, committing murders and robberies while living deeply embedded in underworld life. Louis was expected to follow the same path but rebelled, choosing instead to join the police academy, which instantly turned his family members into bitter enemies. Eventually, Louis grew frustrated with being a police officer until fate brought him together with actor Joe Pesci, a meeting that led to his unexpected invitation to appear in Goodfellas. After the film, Ippolito resigned from the force, wrote a memoir, and appeared in several more movies, gaining a new life thanks to a film about the Mafia. But 15 years after the movie's release, he and his partner were sentenced to life imprisonment when authorities discovered they had been secretly working for the Mafia since the mid-1980s. The corrupt officers were linked to 8 murders and regularly leaked confidential information about raids, informants, and police investigations to organized crime groups. Ironically, in Scorsese's film about the Mafia, the most corrupt police officer in New York history played a mobster on screen. We had been approaching the topic of the Italian-American Mafia for a long time, and I kept wondering how to properly present it, especially since many of you constantly requested breakdowns of The Sopranos, The Godfather, and other crime classics. Then it struck me. When people discuss the Italian Mafia, they tend to picture characters who never truly existed, shaped entirely by films, series, and pop culture rather than historical reality. Actual criminals committed murders, extorted money, and profited illegally, behavior similar to gangs from Los Angeles, El Salvador, or Mexico, regardless of cultural differences. Understanding why they killed and robbed requires context, but going through thousands of pages of case files would interest only lawyers, not ordinary viewers. What fascinates us isn't the Mafia itself, but how it's portrayed in mass culture. Films, shows, memes, and iconic lines like, "An offer you can't refuse." Millions admire actors like Robert De Niro and Marlon Brando, not because they love crime, but because they love the crafted aesthetic of Italian-American mob culture. So our goal became not just to talk about real events, but to explore how truth and cinema intertwine, and how movies influence public perception of the Mafia. We decided to compare what happened in real life with what appeared in films to understand the structure of the Mafia beyond Hollywood's dramatization. Today, we explore the origins of the Mafia and how the genuine organization differed greatly from the stylized, glamorous image created by cinema. Which parts of crime films are accurate and which are complete fantasy? Where did the stereotype of every mafioso being Italian even come from? Could someone actually assassinate a mafia boss without facing consequences? And how did the head of a crime family manage to retire safely if such a thing was even possible? We will also uncover what gangsters really did with concrete and who received the infamous kiss of death, a ritual feared across the criminal underworld. This is Real Stories, and you're watching a channel where stories aren't simply told. They're broken down, analyzed, and explained so you can understand the deeper layers behind them. When discussing the Italian Mafia in America, 2 cities usually come to mind: New York and Chicago, Al Capone, prohibition conflicts, gang wars. But surprisingly, the first major conversation about the Mafia as a large-scale phenomenon arose in an entirely different location: New Orleans. The port city became a refuge for Italians fleeing agricultural collapse and heavy taxation in Europe, hoping to start new lives overseas. As early as 1869, newspapers warned that Sicilian criminals were taking over neighborhoods, forming dangerous groups involved in robbery, theft, and murder. 12 years later, the largest mass lynching in U.S. history occurred when an enraged mob killed 11 Sicilian immigrants. Locals viewed Sicilian newcomers much like they viewed Black Americans, poor laborers willing to work for almost nothing, essentially treated as second-class citizens. Anti-Italian prejudice ran so deep that even Black residents participated in the lynching, revealing the extreme social hostility of the era. The trigger for the mob violence was the murder of the New Orleans police chief, who had been investigating a dispute between two rival Italian clans. Before his death, he warned that the Dagos were after him, a racist slur used at the time for immigrants from Mediterranean countries. 19 suspects were brought to trial, many of whom had no real connection to the murder. They simply lived near the scene of the crime. As the prosecution fell apart, the court began acquitting the accused, causing outrage among locals who believed the Mafia had bribed or intimidated the jurors. Even the mayor publicly fueled the anger, encouraging residents to take justice into their own hands in response to the verdict. This story was ignored by filmmakers for decades, and only 25 years ago did a movie finally depict the events surrounding the lynching. In the movie's version of events, everything was orchestrated by a wealthy businessman who wanted control over local industries and businesses. Although dramatized, the story highlights how prejudice, politics, and economic pressure created the first major mafia myth in America. From this point on, the Italian mafia became a topic of national discussion long before New York and Chicago became its iconic centers. New Orleans became the birthplace of the earliest American mafia legends, shaping public perception long before Hollywood added glamour and drama. As the years passed, stories of Sicilian criminal groups in New Orleans spread across the country, laying the groundwork for the future mythologizing of the Italian mafia. These early tales created the foundation upon which writers, journalists, and eventually filmmakers built the image of a mysterious and dangerous criminal society. Long before movie icons like Vito Corleone appeared, Americans were already forming opinions on Italians based on fear, stereotypes, and sensational headlines. Hollywood would later refine and glamorize these ideas, turning crude prejudice into stylish narratives about loyalty, family, and codes of honor. But the true origins of these myths were rooted in poverty, xenophobia, and cultural misunderstanding, not the elegance shown in classic films. Over time, this blend of real violence and cinematic storytelling created the modern concept of the mafia, half reality, half Hollywood fantasy. To truly understand the mafia today, we must examine both sides, what actually happened and what the entertainment industry chose to present to the world. The contrast between truth and fiction often reveals more about society's fears and beliefs than about the actual criminals themselves. This is why mafia culture continues to fascinate millions, because it blends danger, myth, and psychological depth into a single compelling narrative. Yet the real story is far less romantic. It is a history of discrimination, political pressure, and immigrant communities forced into survival through harsh means. What started as fragmented groups of marginalized newcomers eventually transformed into structured criminal organizations with national influence. The way this transformation was later portrayed in movies is what shaped global perceptions, not the raw historical facts. Today, when we imagine the mafia, we picture suits, cigars, limousines, and powerful dons, thanks entirely to decades of stylized filmmaking. But understanding the difference between cinematic fantasy and real criminal history helps us see how culture can distort our sense of truth. And this is the story we're here to explore. Not just what the mafia was, but what it became in the world's imagination, shaped by fear, art, and legend.